It is an and scenario. We will need hydrogen, we will need renewable electricity, we will need biomass, we will need liquid fuels, we will need CCU, we will need CCS. We need to use the technologies we have to achieve carbon neutrality. And we have to make sure we bring our consumers, we bring society with us. If you actually want to achieve carbon neutrality, you need to use all the tools that are available.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Eurogas webinar. The 30th is not coming. The 30th of June is with us here today, and we're here to talk about the future of gas, more specifically a study commissioned by Eurogas and carried out by DNV GL, which will be presented, which looks in particular at the how are we going to get to 2050. So it models, it's not a scenario study, it's a pathway study, looking at, we want net zero emissions in 2050, what could be the role of the gas sector and decarbonized renewable gas more specifically, and how do we get there. We had a first taste of their findings back on the 9th, and today we will have the full results of the study. In our program today, we're first going to hear from the European Commission. Following that, we'll have a presentation of the study's findings by DNV GL, and we'll have time for questions, of course. And finally, we'll have a short panel of half an hour at the end for some external views on the study, and in particular also how it compares to the many other pieces of research out there. And I'll hand over to James Watson from Eurogas to close at the very end. So a few housekeeping rules before I hand over to our keynote speaker. Please, everyone who is speaking, do stick to time. I'll motion to you if you look like you're going to run massively over time. To everyone who's attending, your microphones are muted, so normally we shouldn't have any interruptions at that end. You are welcome to, however, very welcome to send in questions, and you can do that via the questions tab, which you should see on the right of your screen. When you send in a question, do include your name and your organization. That way I can properly introduce you. Today's webinar is being recorded, so that the recording and slides will be made available on the Eurogas website after this morning. And finally, let's see, we have almost 200 people, and the number is ticking upwards with us already. So I won't keep you any longer, and with that, hand over to our keynote this morning, Dr. Florian Ermacora, Head of Unit for Wholesale Gas and Power Markets at the European Commission. He's been with the Commission for many years, working principally on energy. And today, well, you seem to be in a very good position to speak ahead of the energy system integration strategy, of course, which we're expecting in the next week or so. So, Florian, over to you.
Many thanks. I hope you see me well. So what concerns us most this month is obviously COVID and the need for economic recovery. We have seen emissions going down now recently due to COVID, but that's due to a slowdown of the economic activity. Climate change overall is going on, and it remains a priority for us to act here. So which means the Green Deal agenda, which has been published more than 1 year ago, stays relevant and in the center of the Commission's priorities. We thus have the challenge now to get together the economic recovery on the one hand and the Green Deal on the other hand. This means for us now to put priority to energy efficiency measures, to a renovation wave, infrastructure investments which are future-proof, and a lot of support also to coal regions which are in transition. I'd like to stress overall the importance of security of supply and affordable energies and competitive prices. That's a theme which is as important as decarbonization and part, of course, of the economic recovery, because none of the overall objectives could be seen in isolation. We cannot have a decarbonization but no security of supply or costs of the energy system, which no one can pay. That's important to remember. We have seen over the last years significant CO2 reductions, and this is due to the coal to gas switch. That's important. We have seen air pollution improvements. We have seen that natural gas plays an important role in complementing wind and sun, flexibility, storage possibilities. So from that point of view, natural gas already can play a bridging role really towards the decarbonized economy, provided, of course, that the methane emissions are kept in check and something is done about this, and you will see Commission policy also on this quite soon. Nonetheless, and overall, the long-term strategy, as you all know, has shown the use of unabated natural gas will have to diminish quite fast after 2030. So that's the challenge, I think, overall for the gas system. Now, when we look into the decarbonization of gas, hydrogen is for the moment really the buzzword in that context. Clean hydrogen. You will see, you have seen a number of national strategies on hydrogen, and you will see a Commission strategy on hydrogen very soon. It's scheduled for adoption for next week, a Commission strategy for a hydrogen economy. I can't give you the details of that strategy for the moment, but you can imagine what is needed at this stage is to get the pilot projects running and roll out at large scale, in particular, electrolyzers. We'll need to incentivize the hydrogen economy, the production and the consumption of clean hydrogen with a clear focus on green hydrogen. But overall, what we aim at is the decarbonization. It's the decarbonized hydrogen. But priority is given to hydrogen produced from renewable electricity. We need to be clear about this, not only in terms of incentivizing, but linked to this also terminology. We should all be clear what is clean hydrogen, what is green hydrogen, and you will see this in the strategy. In terms of infrastructure, how will we get the backbone, the hydrogen infrastructure backbone in Europe? How can we link the production centers for hydrogen, clean hydrogen, green hydrogen, and the consumption? How will we link the existing clusters? We have hydrogen clusters there. We have a hydrogen economy, but locally and dispersed. We don't have a European approach to it at this stage. We need, and the strategy sets this out, to be clear about who's going to set up, who's going to refurbish infrastructure, existing gas infrastructure to be made useful for hydrogen. And the overall question, who pays for it? So we will raise this question in the strategy. We will not yet give answers to all of these points, but avenues of direction. We will need to get some sort of competition in a hydrogen market. So we need to put together state incentivization, but already at that stage competition, and in the medium to long term a competitive hydrogen market. We in that context, of course, need to have a lot of research. We put an accent on this. We need a real hydrogen alliance. So that's important for hydrogen, and this is just the start of that debate at the European level with this hydrogen strategy, which is scheduled for adoption next week by the European Commission, together with the integrated energy system strategy. Let's not forget the importance of biogas, biomethane. We have a number of questions there as well, both as regards promotion and as regards regulation and getting market there. For example, we have a lot of decentralized biogas production capacity. How to get this into the biomethane or in the gas market overall? Number of questions on this. So not to be too long on these issues, it is clear that we need to take very concrete steps now on the decarbonization of gas, and the Commission is coming forward with respective strategies next week. And I'm already now grateful and express my gratefulness to Eurogas and the stakeholder community, gas community, in contributing to the making of these strategies. And your contributions will be all the more important when we are going to implement those strategies, because strategy is one thing and the concrete measures are another thing. And while we adopt the strategies, we will prepare the legislative proposals to follow this up. So from that point of view, your today contribution, the study you have released, you have commissioned and released, is of a big importance to us. And we need to stay in touch and be in contact with the practitioners of the gas sector. We will not devise strategies and policies in the ivory tower. That's just not good. We depend on you, and from that point of view, I can really just congratulate you also on the timeliness of your contribution. But this is not a one-off. This is a process over the coming month, and I'm very happy to work with all of you together on this objective. Many thanks for you listening to me.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe one follow-up. You touched on it at the end. The ultimately, this is the starting point of a longer process with legislative proposals to follow. Is there any visibility at the moment on what form or shape or when those might take?
You will see in the strategy, which, as I said, will be released next week, the initiatives we are going to intend to take, even with timelines. I can tell you already now, it's apparent. If we want to incentivize the clean hydrogen production or consumption, this puts the focus quickly and traditionally to the renewables directive and renewables legislation. When we look at getting the market right for it, then traditionally and well known, we look at gas market regulation at the European level, and you will find as a time indication 2021 as a delivery moment, probably mid 2021, which would give us enough time to accomplish this important project within the mandate of the current European Commission.
Okay, thank you. We have one or two questions that have come in, so I'll see if you can answer them briefly. One is a question from Tatiana Bukar about other emissions from hydrogen, specifically NOx emissions. So is there an issue there, and how might that be addressed? So looking beyond carbon dioxide emissions, is there potentially a problem with other kinds of emissions in hydrogen?
I'm not sure whether those emissions come from the hydrogen production, from in particular electrolysis itself. I think there we are really at the upper end of cleanliness. But as I said, overall, we are looking at decarbonization, and there we need life cycle analysis, but it's not just about CO2, it's about the overall emissions as you're used from a number of environmental and climate legislation. And what is maybe new with the current Commission is that when we do the impact assessment for any concrete proposal, we'll do also an intense climate check, looking at the overall life cycle of the production, for example, of hydrogen.
Okay, so clearly a whole life cycle approach in any case. Absolutely. Will be adopted. Yeah, and A final question then. Well, there's two. I'll put them together. They're sort of related. One is from Alexandra Tudoriu at Cogen Europe, which is a question about what is the role for efficient use of the various gases, decarbonized renewable gases going forward, and she says specifically in cogeneration. And I think a related question from Lisa Fisher, which is how the EU will ensure that support subsidies for hydrogen does not undermine market signals for energy efficiency measures and direct electrification. So I think, again, that comes down to how do you best support hydrogen, where it has, and where does it have the greatest value. And after this, we'll move on to DNV GL.
I don't believe in regulation which goes into every detail, setting up a system in all details. I think that's too artificial. What I believe in and we believe in is to have a good frame, a regulatory frame where the best decarbonization technologies, including energy efficiency services and measures, can compete. It should at the end be the most efficient way of decarbonization. Of course, the market itself cannot determine the choices because if you look at the costs of gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, if you just look at the costs, you will not come at the optimal result at this stage. So from that point of view, as I mentioned before, we need to find a good balance between state incentivization, state aid in a largest sense of the word, as I said, including research and rollout of technologies, and competition on the other hand. But it's really creating a level playing field here, and then at the end of the day, it's about the market efficiency and markets determining nonetheless the choice or having a big impact on the choice between the decarbonization technologies. So from that point of view, a detailed regulation on the interaction of all elements, I think in particular at the European level, that's difficult to do. We will find a balance between creating a frame within which these technologies can flourish.
Okay, thank you very much. We could obviously follow up, but I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you once again, Florian, for your time.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So we move on then to the meat of this morning, which is a presentation of the findings of the study, so commissioned by Eurogas, carried out on behalf of DNV GL. And we have two experts from DNV GL joining us today. First, Warner ten Kate, who's a senior consultant for markets and transaction advisory at DNV GL, with more than 10 years experience in international energy policy and gas market regulation in particular. And he's joined by his colleague, Bent Erik Bakken, who's the chief analyst for DNV GL in their energy transition research, someone with many years of experience across sectors, academia, consulting, and for governments, looking specifically at energy and also security issues and the complex questions they raise. So we'll take two of you. We'll do it together. I understand. You've got about half an hour. And as to everyone who's watching, please do send in questions as they occur to you, and we'll take 10 minutes at the end to try and answer as many of those as possible. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, audience, and of course, Mr. Makora for setting the scene so well. My name is Warner ten Kate, as mentioned by Sonia. I'm joined here by Dr. Bent Erik Bakken, who is not only our chief scientist, but also the lead architect of our energy transition model that I will enlighten you about in a few seconds. But first, setting the scene. Can I have the next slide, please? Next slide. this is what we're going to talk about. I'll introduce the study. We'll talk about how to decarbonize gas supply, the consequences for energy systems, how we see the evolution of European energy demand, and finally, my colleague will deep dive with you in a question that is on, I think, a lot of people's mind, on how to decarbonize the building sector as one of the most costly and difficult to decarbonize. Next slide, please. Well, setting the scene, naturally we're all aware that the Paris Climate Agreement was signed in 2015. That set the global pathway, and the EU Commission subsequently followed up with their 2018 strategic long-term vision. Then in 2019, this was then followed up by a Green Deal, which brought us all together here, I would say, that put up the pressure to deliver actually a net zero energy system or economy even by 2050. Eurogas contacted us with this in mind and asked us to assess what role gaseous energy would play in such an energy future, what kind of pathways we would see, and particularly what kind of cost was associated to that, and at a certain point what kind of competitive role decarbonized gas would play in such future. We used, next slide please, and this is the only advertisement I will put out there today as a consultant. We used our modeling work our energy transition outlook model, which is our yearly published global energy outlook on where the energy transition is going. Please have a look if you are interested. It has a lot of interesting stuff, particularly on the 2019 version, and we'll launch a new version in 2020, September. But this is the model that we based our analysis on for the future. Next slide, please. We used it to develop two scenarios. One, the Eurogas scenario, and the other one is the 1.5 TEC scenario. Now, you might remember the 1.5 TEC name. It is partially borrowed from the 2018 strategic long-term vision. And we roughly modeled that to achieve the overall objectives described in there. But as an input, we have exactly the same assumptions for both scenarios with regard to geography, first of all, population development, economic growth, technology cost development, which is important for as we look at technologies and cost, which as technology uptake grows, we see cost of that particular technology coming down. So a large question is, how fast can you scale up a certain technology to make it competitive in the future? And finally, few cost development are similar across the scenario, at least the starting values. After that, the competitive framework will push energy prices one way or another, but starting values are exactly the same. One thing that's not the same is the carbon price assessment put in there. We use two prices. One is the 100 euro ton in 2015 for the Eurogas scenario, and the 350 euros per ton for the 1.5 TEC scenario. And the 350 did not fall out of thin air. It is the value that was also used in the original 2018 1.5 TEC study. This led us to model two net zero pathways in 2050. Now, on a high level, what did that look like for decarbonization? Next slide, please. So we have one reference scenario, which is our ETO 2019, the scenario that we developed annually. And this does not achieve net zero emissions in 2050. It arrives at 76%. However, we have two alternative pathways, which is one, the Eurogas scenario as mentioned, which arrives at the 100%, and the 1.5 TEC, which arrive at the 100%. But what is also important to note that they also achieve the 2030 stated Green Deal objectives, namely 50 to 55% of decarbonization in 2030. So we have one reference, two scenarios, and one goal, which is overall 100% decarbonization in 2050. Next slide, please. These two scenarios then follow a different pathway, and they're different distinct pathways. Now, both see a considerable increase in the amount of energy delivered as electricity, 51% for the 1.5 tax scenario in 2050 and 36% for the Eurogas scenario. However, most notable is the different pathways that gaseous energy uptake is having. In the 1.5 tax scenario, we see a notable decline. And with the Eurogas scenario, we see actually an increase. And this is particularly because renewable and decarbonized gases are entering the mix, helping steer the overall energy system towards net zero carbon neutrality. This is also visible in the graph on the right-hand side, where we show the different decarbonization per sector. And most notable is the different roles that the different trajectories that the building sector and the power production take. 1.5 tech overall has a general decreasing on all sectors, general emissions decreasing on all sectors, whilst the Eurogas scenario shares burden between sectors, notably borrows from power production and helps thereby decarbonize the building sector. Next slide, please. Primary energy supply naturally will be reduced. You need to be more efficient. This is primarily as an effect of the increased electrification, and particularly in the transport sector that sees significant advantages in efficiency in the drivetrain technology. And naturally, it's increasingly non-fossil as renewable energy takes up, but also biomass and biomethane take a larger role in delivering energy to customers. Next slide, please. Well, then we discussed cost in the model. The model is a cost-based model, so it provides us with a particular cost for energy on every energy option that a consumer will choose in the near future. And we found that by using the natural gas grid and by foregoing an extensive retrofit of the building sector, we would actually achieve a far cheaper pathway into the future, a pathway that would save the European consumer about 4.1 trillion euros over the forecasted period, which equates to 130 billion euros between 2018 and 2050. And with regard to the infrastructure investment, we would save approximately 1.3 trillion euros on additional, particularly electricity capex for the forecasted period. This led us to believe that we have the possibility to deliver a cheaper net zero energy future, and that is one that would be much preferable in a way to a far costlier one. Next slide, please. The question is then, how do you get there? Because it's nice to have these figures out there, but as Mr. Emakora said, you need to start working at a certain point if you have a strategy. And particularly on the gas supply, you need a decarbonized gas supply. So next slide, please. We looked into what would this mean. We found that the gaseous energy supply chain itself can decarbonize itself, which is nice for the gaseous energy supply chain or the gas supply chain. But how did we get there? Well, we see significant uptake in hydrogen and biomethane. Hydrogen here, both decarbonized hydrogen and hydrogen through electrolysis, also known as green hydrogen. And still, the uptake of gaseous energy would rise by 18% in 2050 over 2070 levels. However, natural gas supply is reduced over that period by 35%, and even the demand for natural gas as final energy is reduced by 18%. With regard to decarbonization, a similar infrastructure delivering natural gas rather than the energy now supplied by a mix of decarbonized and sustainable gases would have a higher emissions factor, and the new Eurogas supply chain would then be 89% decarbonized by 2050. If you then add to that, and this is a comparison that we generally not make because we address negative emissions to specific sectors, but if you add to that solely biomethane use in the power sector, you would get a full decarbonized energy supply chain with gas with 104% decarbonization. So it's actually overachieving. Next slide, please. However, hydrogen needs to be eventually green, as Mr. Emakora also said in his introduction. And yes, we see that overall uptake of electrolysis as a source for hydrogen production is larger than the equivalent, which is methane reforming combined with CCS. But this will competitively happen in our model roughly around 2040 in the Eurogas scenario. Overall, roughly around 820 terawatt hours of blue hydrogen is delivered in 2050, whilst the green hydrogen supply reaches around 960 terawatt hours. Next slide, please. This will mean, however, and finally, there's biomethane as a renewable source of as methane. We both see, in both scenarios, we see a considerable uptake, both in 1.5 TEC as the Eurogas, reaching similar levels. But from a cost competitive perspective, we see that we looked into the availability of feedstock in a sustainable manner for second generation biomass. We saw that beyond 2030, the uptake actually starts pushing up the price of feedstock due to competitive issues, and thereby, even though we forecast the cost of gasification dropping by 50% over the forecasted period, we see the biomass feedstock that we need increasing by 30% over the period of 2020 to 2050. Which means that you still need a carbon price to bridge to reach a competitive position with natural gas. Then the elephant in the room. Yes, we see a decarbonized energy future with with gases, but we need, next slide, CCS technology to do that. And we see a significant uptake in CCS required to decarbonize the natural gas use, particularly in power and manufacturing in the medium term. We see that the CCS uptake in Eurogas is 17% higher than 1.5 TEC in 2050, but overall is 15% lower for the period, because 1.5 TEC starts to decarbonize a lot faster because of a faster carbon price uptake. But both scenarios then depend for their decarbonization still on a significant CCS buildup in the next years. We did an investigation into storage capacity available based on IOGP estimates. We think that in the end, even with restricted policies, we only use about 11 to 13% of underground storage capability available, which would mean that at the end of the forecasted period, we would still have between 114 and 130 years of storage left. But still, this is an important factor in the overall decarbonization. Then subsequently, we need to build all this infrastructure and develop all these decarbonized gases. What would that do for costs? Next slide, please. Next slide. We see that CapEx in energy infrastructure in general, so that's both natural gas grids and power grids, is decreased in the Eurogas scenario by 34%, or about 1.3 trillion euros, lower than 1.5 TEC. In the graphs below, you can see that the natural gas grid expenditure is a fraction of the power grid expenditure, and actually the 1.5 TEC the Eurogas scenario has a lower average capex over the forecasted periods than the most recent past, and my colleague Mr. Bent-Erik Bakken will dive into that later on why that is. Next slide, please. But why is it cheaper? This is because hydrogen can be delivered through blending and retrofit of the existing network. So that is delivering renewable power or decarbonized power energy to customers and at a lower cost basis than actually building new infrastructure needed to get it there. The 1.5 tech scenario sees a more significant lower uptake of hydrogen than the Eurogas scenario would, and as the model provides us with a blending option for hydrogen into the existing gas grid, we see that hydrogen blended into the system, particularly for residentials, takes a larger share in 2030 and subsequently becomes a more dedicated source of demand in 2050 as hydrogen boilers become more cost competitive with natural gas boilers, and particularly the manufacturing sector driving demand for hydrogen for dedicated hydrogen infrastructure in the first decade of this forecast. In the two green graphs, we showed you that most of the infrastructure that is being developed is retrofit from existing gas grids, and the lower and a small share would still be used or will be new built to facilitate a dedicated hydrogen demand. Overall, this there's a need for the Eurogas scenario still that's quite considerable for 9% of additional new hydrogen capacity to be built per year, a growth rate for the period of 2030 to 2050. Next slide, please. Therefore, most of the capex that we foresee in the gas grid is still dedicated for hydrogen accommodation, like either retrofit or new build. And this will mean, and this is both true for the 1.5 tech scenario and the Eurogas scenario, only at a far more extensive level in the Eurogas scenario. So most of the capex, more than 80% of it, is dedicated to hydrogen. For the period 2030 to 2050, that's even 92% is dedicated to either retrofit or new infrastructure in transmission, distribution, and production of hydrogen. Next slide, please. Then obviously energy needs to be delivered to customers, and one of the key drivers in our model is how does demand develop. So next slide, I wanted to show you how energy demand varies across the two scenarios. In green, the Eurogas scenario, and blue, the 1.5 tech scenario. Both scenarios see a significant buildup of variable renewable energy supply, namely wind, offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar PV. With regards to the in the 1.5 tech scenario, this is 97% of total power produced, and in the Eurogas scenarios, that's 58% of total power produced. However, so that's one major difference why the energy use in electricity generation is considerably lower in the 1.5 tech scenario. And then there's the building sector, which my colleague will talk about shortly. One notable point is that for 1.5 tech, the energy consumption actually goes up in what we dub the other energy sector, which is both sector from own use, so loss through transport particularly, and that is going up in the 1.5 tech scenario because due to the extensive grid output built and the associated losses to that. Then how do the carbon emissions from these sectors look? Next slide, please. Well, naturally, as I showed in the beginning, there's a considerable difference in how the various sectors decarbonize. There are across the board more evenly in 1.5 tech and more burden sharing in the Eurogas scenario, particularly in the power generation sector that offsets nearly 95% of remaining emissions in the Eurogas scenario. And that is particularly because of the CCS uptake in this scenario. And with regard to the buildings, I would like to give the floor to my distinguished colleague Bent Erik Bakken, who will take you into a deep dive of the building sector modeling that we did. Thank you, Bent-Erik. Can you hear me, Bent-Erik?
Next slide, please. Thanks a lot, Werner. Next slide, please. Yeah, so why do we provide you with a deep dive into the building sector? Well, I think this slide shows it quite well. In order for us to achieve the stated goals of the 1.5 tech scenarios, we have our model, which is cost-based. And if we leave the sort of market costs of electricity in the building sector in tech, it doesn't happen. So we need to provide economic incentives. So in practical life, they would come in all different forms. They would come as support to the grid operators and builders. It may come as help for homeowners to buy heat equipment, heat pumps in particular, and so on and so forth. So if you look into the latter period, almost half of the building's energy costs will actually have to be footed by the taxpayers. And why does that happen? Next slide, please. If we look into the building's energy demand by energy carrier, we find that the electricity use is much stronger in tech than in Eurogas. Also, Eurogas scenario sees some relative increase in the electricity use, but the tech sees a much stronger increase in the electricity use. And just next slide, please. Just to remind you that both scenarios actually have almost or close to a complete reduction of the carbon intensity of the building sector, while tech has over 100%. The Eurogas has a little less than 100%. Next slide, please. The real difference of the costs really resides in heat. So here we see to the left, the far left, we see the Eurogas scenario, and in the same pane we see to the right of it we see the tech scenario, and to the left we have the residential buildings, and to the right we have the commercial buildings. These are extremely similar. So I will keep the discussion to the residential sector. Next slide, please. There is actually 4 times more electricity use in the tech scenario when it comes to heat. In terms of hydrogen, the tech scenario has about 40% of the hydrogen that uses the Eurogas scenario. And as you would expect, the tech scenario has only 1/6 of the methane use of the Eurogas scenario. So we see that there is a lot more electricity in heat. Next slide, please. So next slide. Here we see the daily peak load, the blue one, which is tech. And if we average it out, so this is for 2020 from January to December, the average capacity is 15% higher. But the peak capacity is 65% higher. So that really means that in the high electrification of heat scenario, which is 1.5 tech, there needs to be much more power grid that stands idle for a large fraction of the year to be able to accommodate the early parts of the year, so the winter or the late fall, to the right-hand side of the graph. Next slide, please. So here we look at all uses of electricity, but we focus on the bottom ones, which is the green commercial buildings heat demand, and the blue, dark blue, which is residential buildings heat demand. To the left, we have the situation today, and to the right, we have the situation in 2050. And this slide is for the Eurogas scenario. And here we see that the average electricity use is slightly increasing, but the peak is actually being reduced. That has to do with the fact that over time, new technologies will afford demand response so as to even out the most aggressive peaks. However, next slide. If we go to the text scenario, we see that the bottom part of the figure, which is residential heat, and also slightly above that, the green part, which is commercial buildings heat, you know, it basically on cold days, it requires 2/3 of the energy. And so this, you know, happens in the cold season, and to the right, we see the same thing at the end of the year. So this is really the reason why there is so much grid being required for the tech scenario. There is a very much higher peak to average ratio in that scenario, and as we have seen, the power grid costs, even in the Eurogas scenario, are considerable. I think at least a factor of 5, almost a factor of 10 higher than in gas refurbishments, gas grid refurbishments. So of course that really is a huge cost to the tech scenario. So in summary, we have two scenarios that both achieve the Green Deal objective of net zero emissions in 2050, but we have one that reuses the existing technology, and another one that really requires a lot of buildup of a power grid. And we have to admit that this happens in the future, where there's a lot of demand response, and I haven't talked about that. There's a lot of storage also. So all these electric vehicles, they will provide some of their storage to the grid, but even that will really not significantly reduce the peak to average ratio problem of the tech scenario. So with that, Sonja, I give the floor back to you, and perhaps there will be questions to us.
Okay, perfect. Thank you both very much. So the full study will be made available. I realize it's a lot to squeeze into even half an hour, but I think you did a very good job. We have had a number of questions coming in, so I'll try and get through as many of those as possible. One person asked me if the questions are arriving. They are. Don't worry, I'll do my best to take as many as I can. We had a few questions. Let's start with Thomas Novak, so from the European Heat Pump Association. One question was about the CO2 price. Do you apply that universally across all sectors?
Yes, so the CO2 price is universally applied to all sectors. There is no difference in how they are applied. So any emission in any sector is paid by that sector. So for electricity, of course, this you know, the electricity in the buildings don't really emit any electricity, but we assume that that the utilities then will reflect their emissions costs, their carbon price in their further price to their final consumers.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Thomas, which is that energy demand from gas is increased by a margin, but the costs actually go down. So is the assumption that hydrogen will be produced at close to zero cost and also without subsidies? He has a follow-up question, but that's perhaps more for Eurogas itself, which is why does the industry not commit to that route in that case? So is the assumption that hydrogen is produced at close to zero cost is probably the most pertinent question for you.
Well, I mean, we have two ways of producing hydrogen. Reforming with CCS, which sees a relative minor cost decline. Costs are available in the report as it comes out today, which are relatively minor cost reduction over the forecasted period. Because of two reasons. We see cost learning or cost reduction, particularly in the capture part of CCS and less so in the other parts of the technology that you use. And on top of that, methane reforming is relatively mature technology. We see it used across the globe. So there's relatively less cost decrease. And yes, in electrolysis, we see a considerable cost decrease over the forecasted period and that is particularly because electricity becomes available so cheaply, maybe at less run hours, but at least there is a significant amount of a capacity increase in VRES, and electrolysis will start to have a more balancing role added to that, added to the power grid system.
So on the latter point, we see that very clearly that there is a higher fraction of electrolysis in the tech scenario. That's because that scenario has much more variable electricity, so it sort of affords a higher fraction of electrolysis in the hydrogen there.
Okay, and a final question, that note around energy efficiency. You appear to show that electricity demand is less in the Eurogas scenario, and yet there's an increasing proportion of hydrogen made, green hydrogen made from power. So how can that be?
Yeah, so there is in the Eurogas scenario, there is a large increase in variable renewable electricity. So there is a shift from traditional electricity to variable renewable electricity. So that affords days of the year where electricity is very cheap. So that's one thing. So that's on the feedstock price, so to say, for electrolysis. But then additionally, as was mentioned by Warner, you have the technology costs of having these electrolysis plants is gaining experience, and with experience we see cost decline.
Okay, let's move on because there are a lot of other questions. One was from Giuliano Basso, which was a question over power to methane instead of power to hydrogen. Is that something you looked at all? And if not, why not?
We did look into it, but did not build it into the model, as we saw initial costs to be too prohibitive for the longer run. So power to methane as such is not in this exercise. Okay.
And then a question on CDR, so carbon dioxide removals or net negative emissions, which obviously plays a large part in the Eurogas scenario in particular. What can you say any more about your assumption on the need for those kinds of net negative emissions technologies in the Eurogas scenario? And what are the main technologies that you've assumed will be required? So BECCS, biomass with carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, natural solutions. What are the assumptions around reducing those residual emissions as you talked about? Or is it mainly,
so I can start.
Mainly CCS in the power sector, which is one of your graphs seem to suggest?
So if I may start, we assume no direct air capture at all, and we keep the agriculture and forest sector sort of outside, so any regrowth of forests is not a part of this study. We do, however, foresee that almost all power stations that are thermal, I mean that burn fuel, they will have CCS attached to them. And of course, if you burn biomethane or you burn solid biomass, then you are afforded with the bonus that burning of renewable biomass affords. So then you get net negative emissions. So the net negative emissions really happen in the power sector for the Eurogas scenario. All sectors, not all sectors, but also manufacturing benefits from capturing the carbon. And when the capturing is of biomethane in manufacturing, which is this, so then those plants afford so partial net negative emissions.
Okay, a follow-up question. I guess one question is CCS, especially in the power sector, is one area where which hasn't managed to get off the ground. So it seems like a big assumption. And a related question to that is, are you therefore assuming that there's CCS on power stations across Europe, so in every country? And what are your assumptions around the cost of transporting CO2 for storage? Is that in old repurposed natural gas pipelines, or does that require an entirely new infrastructure to be built?
Yeah, so if I may start on CCS, so that's of course costly, and we have all the costs there. There are, I mean, CCS is not a new technology. It has been used for more than 2 decades already. So the question is the transport, but we see that transport, you know, is only 20% of the cost of storing and capturing CO2. So there will be a mixture of reusing natural gas pipelines. So that will be a very minor part. Most of this will have to be built anew, and the costs of that are included in our cost estimates.
Okay. Let's move on from CCS then to a question from Geert de Kok at Transport and Environment around the CapEx for gas grid investments. Does that also include costs involved in 1, distribution grids, 2, changing 120 million, very specific, gas boilers to hydrogen boilers, and finally hydrogen stoves? Is all that included in your CapEx estimates?
Yes, so the costs of in the homes and in the buildings of changing the gas equipment from methane to hydrogen is a part of the cost. It's entirely included in the cost. Of course, it has importance of when you do this. So we assume typically that the uptake of hydrogen happens when the equipment would be renewed anyway. So we assume that there will be relatively minor sort of stranded of the building's assets. But once you would have to change the boiler anyway, you will do that with, instead of having a new traditional gas boiler, you will have the new hydrogen boiler. So those, but initially at least that equipment will be more expensive, and so that's a part of the cost, part of our costs. Okay.
We're not going to have time to take many more questions. I'll try and put just 1 or 2 more to you. And there were a few questions from Konstantin Levoyanis at Hydrogen Europe. A question around imports. Have you factored that into your model? Secondly, a question around blue and versus green hydrogen. He says there are more electrolyzer projects and CCS projects currently planned. So although you showed, yeah, you initially show more of the blue hydrogen and green only taking over later, and indeed in 2050 they're still roughly similar in terms of proportion. And finally, any assumptions on what happens in the next few years, since we wouldn't have any EU regulation actually actively incentivizing or promoting the hydrogen economy until the mid-2020s at the earliest. So any specific assumptions you made around that?
Yeah, Arne, please.
First, I noted imports. We did an additional analysis on the imports. We found that through our modeling that there is no real need for imports, twofold, two reasons, or we didn't saw any emerge. Actually, three reasons. Cost prohibitivity, so like getting it from A to B in a cost-effective manner didn't really add up for us. That is because the use of the existing gas grid and then changing it over closer to home, so through reforming closer to home, proved more cost-effective. And finally, what was my no, that was, we looked into it, but it didn't materialize in the model. Other questions related to blue hydrogen versus green hydrogen. Yes, there's an urgent need to get going. That goes for all the parts of the infrastructure in the model. It is whether you have your renewable power build up, your infrastructure getting done right, the methane, the biomethane needing to be built, and green and blue hydrogen build up need to go. And I think one of the key core messages we found is that it needs to sort of happen all simultaneously, starting actually tomorrow. And yes, that will that will require some additional subsidies with regard to the hydrogen supply in electrolysis, both as in the SMR plus CCS part. So that's also about the next few years. We do not see a real takeoff before 2025 of both CCS and electrolysis, but immediately after that, it needs to start. It starts pretty fast, so you need to get the ball rolling basically yesterday, but tomorrow.
And do you make any assumptions on specific regulation? I'm thinking one of the issues that is yet to be decided is whether electrolyzers can be connected to the grid or require dedicated renewables, for example. Do you make a specific assumption on that?
No, we do not make a specific assumption. Electricity used for electrolysis is a blend from the grid itself. There is subsidies to supply to support uptake of a certain technology based on the two scenarios we developed. So the one aimed for a more aggressive gaseous energy supply strategy, whilst the other one was a more faster uptake of electricity. So these are broadly supported, and then that subsequently the model tells us where that support actually happens.
Okay. Thank you. So let's final question. There were a few questions that came in specifically on what the scenarios or what your pathways cover. Do they cover energy use by the EU27 or EU28 or a smaller subset of countries? And related to that, a question from Harold Stindl: is Europe treated as a whole market region, or do you actually separate out resources regionally? So Europe is one whole, and you assume everything's movable, or yeah, is there any differentiation, granularity within that?
So our European Union is the entire EU plus Norway and Switzerland, and also parts of Europe that is not EU. So yeah, so some of the Balkan countries, so 3 or 4 of those are also part of it. So that's important. And also we include the energy use on intra-European aviation and shipping, but not international, out of Europe shipping and aviation.
Okay, so the UK is part of it as well. I'm managing.
It is. I'm sorry. Yes,
it still is. Yes.
Yes.
As a market region, I think that's also one of the points that the question was making. Yeah, we treat it as one market region, and that means that energy is traded not only between sectors, or emissions are traded between sectors, but is traded between the entire region as such. We do account for transport, but there's no, in a sense, barriers. It's a European energy market if you would complete it, so to speak.
Yeah. The way we would like to see it, yeah.
Not necessarily my words, but yes.
The way that the Commission would like to see it. Okay, I think
very much so.
we're going to have to leave it there because we have a short panel still to get on with. I want to thank you both once again very much for your time, your input, the presentation, and for answering so many questions. We got through not all of them, but most of them. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we come then to the final part of this morning. So we have a short panel discussion to get some external thoughts on the new study. We have three panelists. I should say Penny Weiss, an MEP who was due to join us, couldn't at the last moment. She's actually in political negotiations as I speak. We have instead Wolfgang D'Innocenzo, energy attaché at the Italian Perm Rep to the EU, who has kindly offered to step in at the last moment. I obviously don't expect you to have read the entire study, but it would be useful to maybe get some thoughts from you on what you've heard this morning. I should say Wolfgang is an economist by training, and before starting here at the Perm Rep just about 2 years ago, spent more than 10 years working on energy and international relations, in particular at the Ministry of Economic Development in Italy. So at least this is a field you obviously know something about. So over to you.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. Can you hear me? Great. So thank you very much for having me here. I stepped in at the very last moment. So I've listened carefully to this presentation. Obviously, there's a lot of data to digest. I'm fairly familiar with the long-term strategy that was presented, well, a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, by the Commission, late 2018. So I'm familiar with the 1.5 tech scenario and the other scenarios that were presented in that strategy. Well, first of all, some general remarks. Obviously, we welcome this scenario because it's an additional scenario, and it provides, an additional take on how our energy system could look in 2050. At the same time, I also see that it is important that we keep all the possible scenarios open. So keep all possible options open as long as possible, because obviously this scenario here was a scenario developed for Europe as a whole, geographical Europe. But obviously the energy mixes and energy demand looks very different in the various EU member states and other countries in Europe. So there's no one size fits all, and that is something that we definitely have to take into account. Just think of, for instance, the huge difference between the current rate of electrification in Northern Europe compared to Southern Europe. That's one, just to mention one. I've seen very briefly in this presentation mentioned the issue of trade, of energy trade. Now, Europe is probably one of the largest energy importers in the world today. And we see that in the various scenarios that were designed so far, that Europe's dependency on imports from third countries, or well, the rest of the world, diminishes between now and 2050. Now, what would be interesting to understand is, in this scenario, but I guess it is possible, to have a more precise understanding of what our trade relations with our main suppliers will look like, especially of gaseous fuels. Well, obviously with Russia, with North Africa, and with all the suppliers of LNG that we have. So in a way, we see, Europe's wealth is built and was built in the past decades mostly on importing raw materials and exporting finished goods. And this gave us also a sort of a sway on our partners. So it kept us relevant also for our partners. So I would imagine, I would hope that this scenario also keeps this well, takes into account the importance of keeping the relations with third countries and with energy suppliers alive, because it's hard to imagine that Europe becomes an island, an energy island in 2050, and trade with all these with all suppliers is simply diminishes and disappears. It is something that we should definitely consider. Then on why there are huge cost savings in this scenario. So in the Eurogas scenario compared to the 1.5 tech scenario. Well, first of all, I see that there is this effort to make best use of existing infrastructure on the one hand, so without the need to dismantle existing mainly gas infrastructure, and build new electricity infrastructure on the one hand, and on the other hand, also the fact that electricity infrastructure compared to energy delivered is much more costly than gas infrastructure. I mean, probably we're talking about kilowatt hour delivered through the electricity vector. Just for paying for infrastructure is probably 4 to 5 times as expensive as delivering that same amount of energy through a gaseous or molecular vector, such as natural gas or hydrogen or other synthetic gases. So this is something that we will look very much forward to, and would like to also understand exactly how the savings are achieved. Obviously, we have some. We see that, for instance, on the demand side, we don't have a strong use in transport in this scenario, which is slightly different from what we see nationally in our scenarios. And then there are some open questions that would need to be addressed on how to implement it. And this is the role of TSOs, gas TSOs, and would that be possible? Would it be possible to imagine it the way that we're imagining the role of, for instance, electricity TSOs in power storage? The role of synthetic fuels, and how to repurpose existing pipelines and infrastructure specifically for industry, because industry, especially steel, is where, but also other sectors are the ones that is the sector where pure hydrogen would most be needed. And just finally, well, the high level of attention to hydrogen is obviously something that has happened basically in the past 2 years. So it seems to be the higher scenarios for hydrogen in the Eurogas scenario compared to the long-term strategy 2 years ago seems to be justified. But it will need to be implemented also through these various instruments that will be deployed on the supply side, such as IPCEIs, the Innovation Fund, and national resources. So this is it from our side, and thank you very much. Happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. I think some very useful feedback. We had one of the questions to our two DNV GL representatives was indeed the role of imports, and they said that we're not assuming any imports. So interesting that you say we need to think about the trade dimension also for political strategic regions. And I think also the north-south differences within Europe. Again, we had questions, is Europe treated as a whole? So yeah, important to remember that whilst that works for modeling purposes, in the real world, of course, there are very different pathways being developed in different parts of Europe. And on synthetic fuels, indeed, as for synthetic methane, I understand that hasn't been modeled in this case, because when the work was undertaken, that's almost a year ago, the costs of that seem prohibitive. Obviously, things are changing rapidly. So thank you for that. We have, please do send in your questions as we continue with the panel. You're welcome to leave your camera and microphone on, Wolfgang. We'll bring in our two other panelists. That's Dries Akke, Director for Energy Systems at the European Climate Foundation. And secondly, following him, Eva Hennig, Chair of the Eurogas Distribution Committee and Head of Energy Policy at TÜGA. So that's a network of nearly 100 municipal utilities in Germany, working across gas, water, electricity, and so forth. But Eva's focus is specifically on gas in that context. I will come to Dries first, but I guess I wanted both of you. I thought originally we could focus a little bit on heating as one of the sectors where this study comes to differing conclusions than many other studies out there. So any thoughts on that? One or two other points I picked up was indeed where I think, as I don't remember who exactly put it, but we're foregoing a big renovation wave in buildings here, which saves a lot of money. At the same time, that's a renovation wave is one of the goals of the European Commission at the moment. So yeah, how much renovation are we going to have, and do we want? I imagine there's also other reasons to have a lot of renovation. And a question that came in earlier was around blending, the role of blending, and the fact that if you blend hydrogen in with natural gas, your CO2 reduction is actually not that great, still less than 10%. So is that something that really makes sense? And blending, I guess, is something we're talking about specifically in the context of heating. And I think finally the role of energy efficiency. And again, that comes back to one of the questions we had earlier, how ambitious can and should we be on energy efficiency, direct electrification as part of that, rather than accepting that, well, maybe we can have more gas, decarbonized renewable gas, maybe that's more affordable, but yeah, what are the implications for actually using less energy finally? So those are just some of the points I picked up on. You're obviously free to comment on those or add your own. Dries, let's come to you first.
Yep, thank you, Sonia, and thanks everybody for inviting me, especially Eurogas, of course. First, let me congratulate Eurogas and the consultants on the work. We welcome the fact that the central question to this study is indeed, and I quote, that the European gas industry must find its way to thrive in a world without gases. That's indeed a good summary of the challenge. I sympathize with the challenge. Net zero is a game changer for the conversation on the role of gas. The bridge for fossil gas that we all like to talk about has become very short but also narrow. Actually, it almost disappeared, really. So that makes the changing perception on the role of gas, I think, one of the main indicators for the success of the Green Deal. And looking at this study, you can certainly say that this conversation is happening. And again, we appreciate the opportunity and we sympathize with the challenge for a fossil industry to repurpose itself. However, there's some elements in the study that I think indicate that the message is not completely landed yet. It takes time. The study still speaks to this hope, to this attempt from the gas industry that to say that it will be kind of fine, that there are some challenges, but that overall the way the current gas industry works will be more or less fine and future-proof. But that's of course not the case. The truth is that we're talking about a complete deconstruction of the gas industry. Basically, everything where you currently make money on will change. Volumes will change. Trading, I think the Italian perm rep was right to point out the global trading element is, it completely changes. So ownership of assets, you'll be trading an expensive fuel, like every green gas is an expensive premium fuel. So that entire business model that you currently work on, and there's of course different layers, is not going to easily transform into the future you're projecting for yourself. And that has really repercussions, like who is going to invest in all that and who's going to invest in all that repurposed gas infrastructure if your returns are declining. So let me give you some examples directed to the study of where I see this kind of continued conflict between accepting the challenge but not yet having landed it. First of all, maybe the most important is that the perspective on methane leakage is completely lacking. Well, there is an annex page where things are said like it is an outside Europe problem, so it's not our responsibility. I also read the phrase once in a pipeline, such emissions are negligible. It's not true. We see the satellite data. If the problem is getting clearer, more measured, and therefore bigger, the importance of an LCA approach is therefore much more important, and we look forward to the Commission strategy on that. Really, we do. There's also point number 2. There's 5 of those. There's still 3 petawatt-hour of fossil gas, which is then covered by this massive CCS uptake. Yeah, I mean, I can elaborate, but let's say like this is the easy way out, isn't it? The question is, so much CCS on power plants, gas power plants. Do we see any company investing in this? Have we checked this reality versus an investment portfolio of gas companies? It's a mismatch. We also see, number 3, we also see 1 petawatt-hour of biomethane compared to 20 terawatt-hours today. This is quite an exaggeration. Yeah. Biomethane is part of the solution. We're absolutely not against it, but the volumes will not be at that level. It will be relevant locally. I cannot see how we will start trading something that we have to pick up from rural areas into an European system. Yeah. Then to the point of Sonia, the question of buildings is indeed quite core. There's very different views. Just if you look at the Gas for Climate reports from a couple of months ago, they have basically from the gas TSOs, I think that's a consortium. They show a massive decline in gas-use energy carriers in buildings, and they don't project any hydrogen at all for buildings, which makes a lot of sense because refurbishing that entire distribution gas grid to hydrogen ready plus the appliances, it is, yeah, I cannot understand why the costs are not higher for that. Yeah, it's a recurrent issue. It's a complex matter. We certainly agree with that. But let me just ask one question: who is going to pay for keeping all that underutilized distribution gas grids in place when the volumes will be so low? These are volume-based tariffs. If if they need to cover for emission, people will want to switch off. It will be just too expensive to be connected to the gas. Last point, and a question to Eurogas really. I think what certainly touching upon helpfully is that green hydrogen is going to be part of the solution, maybe blue hydrogen as well. We don't have any ideological opposition to that in any way, as long as it's carbon neutral. But green hydrogen will be important, and the Commission is right to prioritize that. So your future depends, so the future of the gas industry, if you paraphrase a little bit, depends on major scale up of solar and wind. So my question is Eurogas planning to ask for higher renewables targets for 2030? Is that going to be part of your policy position as well? So in conclusion, we welcome and appreciate the gas industry looking at its role in a carbon-free economy. We certainly do. But yeah, we see it's a bit concerning to turn yourself into all kinds of curves just for the sake of giving the message that it's going to be quite all right. And so the message to policymakers in the Commission and the European Parliament, I think it's time to get on top of this debate, lift it beyond the current state of pitched industry pitches or even NGO pitches. Yeah, we do that as well, of course. So is there a time, is it not time for a Parliament study on the role of gas? Is it not time for the Commission to publish a full LCA taxonomy for green gases? Can we ask the JRC to measure the potential of biomethane, of economic available biomethane? These things are becoming really important. Otherwise, we're not really making progress. We're just pitching, we're influencing, we're confusing, we're delaying, and we're lobbying. And I think we need to move beyond that way of working. Thanks.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much, Dries, for picking up on all those points. Let's turn straight to you, Eva, then. Maybe you can come back on some of Dries's questions, the broader ones, and particularly on distribution as well, since that's your area of expertise. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sonia. I suppose I have to speed up now.
Well, we can take an extra 5 or 10 minutes at the end if I've seen a few questions come in, so the questioners will hang around. But yeah, if you can make it in the next 5 minutes, that would be great.
So I'm going to pick up what Dries has said. It's going to be quite a ride. For TUGA, which is a company that is over 150 years old, we've seen quite a lot of different rides. And so I think I have a different opinion on the question that everything will change and that it seems to be nearly impossible, because this is not the first time we have a whole change in the gas sector. We came from town gas. We have at the moment, we have the L-gas, H-gas switch. So this is a continuous process that we see. Maybe as a TUGA as a company, we have 100 local and regional utility companies, which are majority owned by the cities and the communities. And we live in the sector coupling. We always lived in the sector coupling because we do electricity, gas, and district heating. So this is why we really welcome the study, because it has a holistic view. And that's what you need. We came from the DENA study in Germany, which was the first time we did everything together. And what we like very much in this study, that it's addressing heating in a different way than it's usually looked upon in Brussels, because most people think that to decarbonize heating is considered as being a lot easier than decarbonizing the industry. And that's definitely not what we see. We don't see it in the renovation rates. We welcome very much the renovation wave. I think it's very important from own experience of renovating our house, knowing that nobody else around us is renovating houses, because people are just, they think they're too old, it's too costly, that there's not enough workforce. So I think that the renovation wave is just coming at the right time. But we also have a Green Deal. And in Germany, when the Green Deal goes through, we would have to halve the CO2 emissions on the non-ETS sector. And this is definitely not possible with electricity. That's just not feasible. This means that we will have to decarbonize the gas sector to speed up the decarbonization of the heating. And this is why I'm picking up on what Dries, the question, which is always around, is blending sensible? Is it payable? Aren't if you blend 20% of hydrogen, isn't this too low? Is it really worth the effort? And yes, as a DSO, it's definitely worth the effort, because it's a first step. It's not that we're going to stay in blending until 2050, but it's a necessary first step. and it already brings you up to 6.5% of CO2 reduction. And I think 6.5% is quite a lot already, and it can be done with the existing appliances, and it can be done with the existing grid. And this is why so many projects are now coming online. You know that the UK is doing a lot about it. But what is important for us as local companies, that hydrogen will not only be produced in those large 100 megawatt plants, maybe offshore. Hydrogen will be produced locally and will be produced very close to the customers, where you have very few losses. And you would be amazed on how many technologies are just coming up. I'm just pyrolysis has kickstarted now a couple of months ago, and every week there's somebody new coming up with a new technology, producing hydrogen from wastewater, producing hydrogen from biomethane. So through those research programs which have been running in the last few years, now the results are coming up. So what we think as local distribution companies, it's not that we're going to see less gas, extremely less gas, as maybe Dries you have put it, because you asked the question, how will it stay payable? I think we will see a lot of renewable and decarbonized gases coming in locally, which makes us also independent of the hydrogen backbone, because until the hydrogen backbone in the countries will be converted and partially constructed, you would be sitting in Bavaria and in Baden-Württemberg in the south, and you would sit there also with your industrial consumers, not to be forgotten that 55% of all industrial consumers, large ones, bigger than 100 million kilowatt hours, are connected to the distribution grid in Germany and not to the TSOs. Meaning you would sit there with your hands in your lap and wait until hydrogen comes through the pipelines. And this is why we think that the local projects are important, that they will really move ahead, they will make people interested. Florian said it, to kickstart the demand, the interest for hydrogen. When you produce the hydrogen locally, you also have the chance to deliver pure hydrogen to industrial consumers, maybe also to fueling stations. And I know we don't talk about leaked strategies, but when you look at it, there is also mentioning of the decentralized production of hydrogen to be able to deliver this to the industrials. And I think this is a very important. Looking at the heating sector, I think just looking at electrification, which is often done, is coming from a company which is doing gas and electricity and district heating, is far too easy and it doesn't really show what's happening outside. We have never built so many connections for gas consumers as in the last 2 or 3 years, because people are moving away from heating oil. People are not fast enough with the renovation for whatever reasons. There are various reasons, but still they want to at least connect to the gas grid. So through the decarbonization of the gas grid, and with the installation of new heating technologies, and I would like to mention at least the fuel cell, because the fuel cell has the big advantage that it's very highly efficient, that you produce the electricity in your basement, which you can then drive in your car. But this is one of those technologies where I think it's a real game changer, because the fuel cell will be used in everything, in trains and in cars. So this whole technology will develop all over the world, which bring the costs down. So I think that the heating sector is the one that we are looking at, and this is very good that the study is really having an in-depth view, different to maybe what you saw in Gas for Climate, which had a different, let's say, a different view on that market. I hope that was fast enough.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. I have a few questions, not as many as to the study authors. You'll be pleased to hear, but a couple which I probably for you, Eva. What has to be done to high pressure steel pipelines for them to be able to carry 100% hydrogen, particularly around embrittlement, so avoiding them, I guess, breaking apart? That's from Michael O'Mahony. And a second question from him, similar in scope: what are the limits of hydrogen blending and natural gas where there are downstream CNG stations for road transport?
Okay, first question, high pressure pipes, it depends on what kind of steel you have. Luckily, at the distribution level, at least, we have steel where we think we can go up to 100%, but that has to be tested. Everybody's testing. All the labs in the world are testing, from the US to Korea to Japan to Germany and all around Europe. The UK is doing a lot of testing. So I think we're getting closer to find out which kind of steel specifically needs what, whether you can do something with adding of oxygen to prohibit, for example, embrittlement. It's too early to have a list, which I can tell you, well, that's exactly the steel where you can go that far. Looking at the distribution sector, we are very lucky that we have a very, very high percentage of polyethylene. So polyethylene it's clean for hydrogen. So we're looking at all the other components, and this is why we go step by step at every component that is installed in the grid to figure out, are there any very tiny small components that could be that could have a problem with the hydrogen. We talk to all the producers of those components to make sure that we really know what we have to look at specifically. But we, from the development that we've seen in the last 2 years with all the research which is done by the industry, especially our technical associations, it looks very good. CNG stations, I know we have at CNG stations, we have the 2% limit, which is a pity. I still hope that this will change in the future. I know that there are cars which can take a lot more hydrogen, but this still means as long as you cannot ensure that every car which is driving up to your CNG station can take up more, you would have to take out the hydrogen if you have a higher blend. This is why we're working on projects with membranes to be able to ensure that you have only the 2%. But this is that's not such a big science. We're not talking about nuclear fusion. Those membrane projects have been around now for a couple of years, and I think it looks very good that we can also deliver them at a cost-efficient level. But of course, it would be very important that also the CNG cars in the future can take up more hydrogen.
Okay, and one more question to you, picking up on what Dries had asked as well around the costs. How can the costs not be higher than the study suggests? And can you give any indication of the minimum throughput a distribution grid in your case would need to have to keep it economically viable? So if we're going to have fewer volumes, but we need to do all this conversion, how does the maths work out?
So there are 3 questions in that. What is the throughput? The throughput that you need to don't have a very large increase in your tariffs will depend on the age of your grid, because it depends on where you are with the depreciation of your grid. So there's no direct answer for this. I'm not afraid of the throughput because we have such a large industrial and commercial throughput through our grids, and we still think that fuel cells will pick up. And if you look at the fuel cell, you will use more hydrogen in the future than you will lose it because it's CHP. But there's not one number that I could tell you what the throughput has to be. Of course, when you go into the renovation in the future, so you have a constant renovation of your grid every year, you always have to look what is the size of a diameter that you would need. But the bigger the grid, the better for you, because then you have more line pack, and then you can play with the production of your hydrogen. Local line pack will deliver in the future some part of the storage that you will need, especially when you combine power to gas plants with PV, which is definitely something that will happen locally. Sorry, what was it still? The throughput, the cost, why are the costs not higher? I think it was mentioned before that in the study, the renovation of the heating itself is done during the time that the renovation life cycle is going. Meaning you would roll in, which is happening in the UK in the discussion now. I can only invite everybody to look at Hy4Heat. As soon as we have the hydrogen ready boilers on the market, and hopefully they will not be much more expensive than an existing natural gas boiler, and the more of them are produced, the cheaper they will get. So there will be a moment when we have price equality. So when you start rolling out the hydrogen boilers, that means that you have something already in your basement that can switch from 100% natural gas to a blend of 20%, the new ones probably up to 30%, and then do the whole switch up to 100%. This means that you don't go into a grid, you take away all the boilers and you substitute them, you go along with the timeline. And this is why we think that the blending is an important first phase, because otherwise, when you look at your customers, it's important to take the customers along. Social acceptance is key. And so the whole project that we are looking in needs to have a roadmap where you go grid by grid, you talk to your customers, you figure out who has what, you have to talk to your industrial consumers, because you cannot just show up with 100% of hydrogen in front of your industrial consumer and say, hi, here I am. So you always have to make sure that you understand what your customers need, and you have to help them to take then in the future that they have offers so they can decide. And I think that this is the reason why the costs are not higher, because it's a very efficient way to go through this phase that you say you start with blending, you start with the renovation of the heating systems and the houses, and then you come by and by and by, and the more hydrogen you will have, the bigger chances is that you can also convert to 100% of hydrogen, maybe after the results that we will hopefully see in Leeds and in the H21 project.
Okay, thank you. We have, that's it largely for questions. I think we're going to have to come to a close. I'd like to give maybe Bent Erik and Warner as the authors of the study. I mean, a few of the points that Dries raised. Do either of you want to come back on that? The assumptions around methane leakage, the volumes of biomethane. And we had one question come in from Alex Forbes, again on CCS, and again the point of can we, you know, why do you think the technology will become mainstream fast enough to include it to the extent you have in your scenarios? And after this, I'll hand over to James Watson to close. Go ahead.
So a lot of questions. If I just start with the assumption of Dries that gaseous volumes will decline, well, as we indicated early on, they will not decline. They will stay more or less at the current level, increase a little bit even. So the cost issue, at least from a capacity utilization viewpoint, is at least in our analysis, is not really there. On the cost of equipment, I think I have talked about that earlier. So the whole point is that the grid cost of affording heating of buildings is where the real cost is, and the refurbishment of the equipment in the homes is much smaller than that. Warner?
Sorry, what was the final question regarding?
It was again a question over coming back to CCS. What makes you think it will become mainstream enough to include it to the extent you have? There was the point around your assumptions around methane leakage and the biomethane volumes in particular, that those seem very high.
Yes, the biomass, well, let's take biomass first. We did a biomass availability analysis and found it to, yes, pushing the boundaries, but not crossing it with regard to second generation biomass for gasification. We do see a cost increase because of biomass scarcity in the model. So yeah, it is a high, it might be considered a high number, but it is not necessarily higher than any of the other studies out there. So that's one thing. If you know, if you don't believe us, we're not crossing any boundaries with regard to other studies. Regarding CCS, I mean, it is the main driver for CCS uptake remains the carbon price, because that provides a business. We see that CCS technology as currently is compatible at roughly between 100 and 110 euros per ton, and that you know, that arrives fairly rapidly in the 1.5 tech scenario, and otherwise around also gets achieved by the Eurogas scenario. So there's a clear incentive there to continue to build, and particularly because cost decrease, margins increase along the way. The last question was related to, please help me, Sonja.
Methane leakage.
Methane leakage, yes. Naturally, methane leakage is a primary concern. We did engage in an additional analysis to see whether this would materially affect our outcomes with regard to the overall decarbonization. It did so to a limited extent on the sort of precondition that the gas industry continues to work on it and progressively reduces their methane leakages. Mr. Van Akker addressed the point that within Europe we do not consider that. We did consider leakages, but we do see that it is, you know, the performance in Europe itself is far better than outside, and therefore we mentioned that. And we need to, I think, highlight that Norway is part of Europe in the system, so there's a large supply share considered also fairly efficient there. So methane, absolutely an issue, but you know, we thought it within the safe margins of our analysis.
Bent Erik?
Yeah, so it was just addressing another issue that came up, that our study did not include imports. That is not correct. We have no hydrogen imports, but we do have imports of natural gas, a lot of it, obviously. So that's just a clarification.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we're going to have to leave it there. I feel we could carry on, but I'm sure you all have other appointments to be getting to. I'd like to thank all of you very much for your time once again, and hand over to James Watson from Eurogas to close for us. James.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sonia. Yeah, it's been a great morning. Really enjoyed all the contributions from Florian, from our friends Varna and Ben Eric, and indeed from the panel. I think really showed a lot of insights, a lot of interesting comments, including seeing the value of the study. And I think it is important that we have studies. I think it's important that we build a wall of knowledge to understand exactly what we need to do to achieve our carbon neutrality objectives. And I do think the study does pick on a number of very important elements that I think we can all agree on. We certainly see energy efficiency, almost a third reduction in energy consumption between 2017 and 2050, an enormous rollout of variable renewable electricity. We're seeing an increase from around 18% today, well over 50% of electricity coming from renewables in the future. I think that's very important. But one of the elements that we are very keen on and what we see here is that the fact that there is also a need for molecules. And generally we can say there is biomethane, but there's also hydrogen. I think one of the main findings from the study that is important is that we look at hydrogen, and we need to start making that hydrogen economy happen now. It's not a question of waiting to act. We need to start moving forward and delivering those carbon neutral molecules as soon as possible. Every scenario, every study that I've seen accepts there's a certain degree of decarbonized and renewable gases that we'll need for the future. And so from my point of view, we need to make sure that we're taking the guidance that the studies, the wall of knowledge is giving us, and we start listening to these people and start developing the right legislation. I know a lot of people keep saying, CCS has been around for a while, it's never going to get off the ground, etc., etc. We've been here before. I would remind people that 30 years ago, solar existed. Solar Power Europe, or EPIA, was founded in 1985. It remained a niche until about 2010, and the reason that it took off, it changed, is because of legislation. The CCS is in the same boat. If there hadn't been legislation, solar and wind would be in the same position today as they were 30 years ago. We need legislation, and that legislation needs to drive the carbon price. If we drive the carbon price, you can make CCS happen. We need the regulation, we need that intervention, we need to use the market around CCS for carbon pricing. So I don't think these are things that are impossible to do, but it does depend on setting the right framework to deliver those points. I think it's also important the study doesn't see the European Union as an island. We're not an island. We've had a long tradition of relations on energy and many other things. And so I think it's important that we also continue that in the future to maintain good relations with our neighbours, good relations with the world, and look to where we can import the cheapest and cleanest fuels from. This is something that we should consider as a huge opportunity for us. And certainly I see that for the gas sector. We're the leaders in electrolyzer manufacturing. We're the leaders in the production of anaerobic digesters. We have so many technological leadership possibilities in the clean gas sector that we ought to make sure that we develop them here and then export them to the world so that the world can export cheap, clean fuel back to us. We'll also help them reach their targets. And the point about not being an island is that if we achieve carbon neutrality but nobody else does, that won't save mankind, it won't save the planet. We need to make sure that the technologies we have are therefore exported, and we need to look to make sure that we no longer see ourselves as an island, but actually see ourselves as part of a functioning global commitment to delivering the clean technologies we need. And CCS will be needed globally, not just here. So why shouldn't Europe lead on that technology and then deliver that solution to the world? I think that the final point I was making before stopping, we'd be glad to know, is to say that I don't think we should think about green gas as a premium product in 2050. We had hydrogen in the system in many countries, in Leipzig, in Dresden, in Dublin, in Leeds, many parts of the world, many parts of Europe, I should say, sorry, that used hydrogen up until the 1980s. That was called town gas. Up to 50% was hydrogen. We can surely start using that as an example of what can be achieved in the future. We can certainly, as Ava's pointed out, use the grids to deliver hydrogen once again to people. And I think that that's a very important element that we have to understand. We do need to change, we do need to bring hydrogen in, but it's something we've done before, and it's not something we should be afraid of, it's not something we should be scared of. We can do this, we have a history of doing it, and therefore, in 2050, green gas won't be a premium. And I use the renewable electricity, for example, again, 10, 15 years ago, wind, solar, premium electricity. Not today, certainly not by 2050. So let's think with open minds, open hearts, and look at all of the different opportunities that we have in front of us, because we will need them all if we're going to achieve our objective. I will stop there, but I have to say again, thank you to everybody. Thank you mainly as well to the attendees. And we have nearly about 250 at one point. We've had 230 you stay. I really appreciate that because we've overrun by quite a lot. You've stayed, you've asked questions, you've done the right thing, you're asking for rigor in the study. I thank Werner and Bert-Erik again for the study, for the work they've done over the last year. It's been a true labor, but I think they've done a really great job. And once again, thanks to you, Sonia, for great moderation. And thanks, Eva, Wolfgang, particularly for stepping in at the last minute. And Dries, really great to have you on today, and very, very helpful to hear your points of view. And I will thank the Eurogas team who've set up this great event today and made a huge effort to do that. So thank you to you all. And for anybody who's interested in further discussion on the study, ourselves, Werner, Bert-Erik, we're very happy to answer your questions. So please follow up with us offline. I think all that remains for me to do is say thank you again, and wish you all a very good day. And let's keep in touch as we all push forward to achieve that carbon and climate neutrality objective for 2050. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.